Okay, you can see that we've still got a few people dialing in, but let's get started for the sake of keeping to time. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to this Torchlight AI webinar. We'll be looking at the implications of Xi Jinping having claimed a third term as the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary. My name is Anna Wilton, and I'm one of the Directors of Geopolitical Intelligence here at Torchlight, and I'm very pleased to be here chairing the discussion today. So a few housekeeping points up on the screen before we get started, and I'm sure that you'll be familiar with these from the last few years. So the main things to note are, firstly, that we'll be recording the webinar, and everyone who's dialed in will receive a copy so you can watch it again at your leisure. And secondly, you can submit questions anonymously through the chat function throughout the presentation for discussion at the end. We've already received some really good questions, which our speakers are looking forward to answering, and I would encourage everyone to submit more as we go along. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask privately, or you think of any after the webinar, you're also more than welcome to email us afterwards, and our contact details will be up on the final slide. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. First up, we'll have Cyrus Yao, who is based in Hong Kong, and he's one of the analysts on our Asia team. And following Cyrus will be Dr. Judith Jacob, who is our head of APAC. Both of those are avid China watchers. So to give you a quick overview of the agenda before I pass things over to Cyrus, he'll begin by discussing the domestic and the political economic implications of Xi taking a third term, and of the personnel and the policy changes that he's already made or we're expecting him to make in the next year. After that, Cyrus will talk about Xi's likely focus on national security issues and the form that that's likely to take, including the implications it will have for the tech sector and its regulation. And finally, he'll look at the government's expected health policy, specifically in relation to COVID-19 and the potential timeframe for easing of public health restrictions. After that, Judith will move on to discussing the foreign policy implications of Xi's third term before we turn it over to you for questions. And I'll hand over to you now, Cyrus. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm Cyrus. So if you have ever read any reports from me and Judith, they are probably about China and also the Greater China region. So I'm happy to talk about China's future policy forecast for the next year. So as you may all know, President Xi Jinping just successfully came a third term in office as the General Secretary of the CCP in the Party Congress last month. So first of all, the most important implication is that he consolidated his power to a level that have not been seen for many years in China. So take the major decision-making bodies as an example. So Xi Jinping and his allies actually claimed all of the 7 seats within the Politburo Standard Committee, and also claimed more than 2/3 of the seats in the 24-member Politburo. So they are all the top decision-making bodies in China. So it means that Xi Jinping and his allies will likely also claim most of the important position in the government next March, when China organizes the 2 session meetings, which will officially conclude the leadership reshuffle. So the major implication is that Xi Jinping has consolidated his power to a level that we have never seen since Chairman Mao. So he actually broke a lot of norms regarding leadership reshuffle within the CCP, like age, experience, and also power sharing. So none of his predecessors has ever been able to insert such a great amount of his allies to the standard committee that Xi Jinping has now. For instance, there has been a party faction called Communist Youth League, also known as Torchlight in Chinese. So actually it's one of the most famous and also influential party faction within the CCP. So it is formerly led by former President Hu Jintao and also the current Premier Li Qiqiang. But the League will no longer have any representatives in the Standard Committee anymore following this year's Party Congress, because Xi Jinping's group has already secured all of the top positions. So Xi Jinping's dominance actually suggests that there will be a continuation of China's economic and domestic policy in the coming years. Given that most of the important positions will be filled by his allies, Xi Jinping will likely face minimal opposition and also balance from the internal decision-making bodies. And therefore, its own political objectives will therefore continue to take precedence over economic growth during future policymaking. So indeed, when we look at the ninth of the Standard Committee, one of the biggest surprise will be the selection of Li Chan. Li Chan is actually the current Shanghai chief of China. So he will rank the second highest official in China next year, and will likely replace Li Qiqian as the next premier next March. So Li Chan actually doesn't have a lot of experience working in the central government. So he's now working in Shanghai, and he also previously served in different province governments. So Li Chan is really loyal to Xi Jinping, and is the major reason behind why he can claim the second highest position in China. So the position of premier is also the architect of China's economic policy. So it's likely that the selection of Li Chan will likely impact China's economic policy in the next few years. Li Chan actually doesn't have quite a lot of experience managing national economic policy, but he has a good relationship with foreign companies in Shanghai. However, his determination to follow Xi Jinping's political thoughts, for example, he's really strictly implemented the zero COVID policy in Shanghai this year, including a months-long lockdown across the city in Q2. It means that Li Chan's economic design will likely also be impacted by Xi Jinping's political thoughts, and will favor his own social goals in the coming years. We can also see from the graphs that Xi Jinping has placed a lot of focus on topics such as national security, technology, and also modernization in his work report. These ideas are actually not entirely new, but they will gradually take a greater role in Xi Jinping's policymaking in the next few years. This is because that Xi Jinping has to differentiate himself from the previous Chinese leader, like Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, who mainly focused on facilitating the development of economic policy in China and try to improve the wealth of Chinese people. So Xi Jinping is actually trying to differentiate himself by focusing on more social goals and try to improving the quality instead of just wealth of Chinese people's life. So such an emphasis on quality instead of quantity of development will see China's economic performance remain weak in the next year. The country has actually seen a worsening economic performance over the past year, mainly because of the pandemic and also Xi Jinping zero COVID policy. So we expect that because of the ongoing COVID control, the economic performance will likely remain weak and continue to struggle. And therefore, China will almost certainly miss its annual GDP growth target of 5.5% by the end of this year. The weak demand at home and also abroad, coupled with Xi Jinping's own non-economic objectives, suggest that a rapid economic turnaround will also remain unlikely in the next year. So at the Party Congress, Xi Jinping also focused a lot on the importance of social goals, like the concept of common prosperity. So he actually introduced a new concept calling the government to regulate wealth accumulation of the private sector. So this actually indicates a high possibility that the government will try to do more frequent interference in business affairs in the next few years. It will include a harsher antitrust campaign or even a reform of the tax system. Therefore, we suggest that international firms have to prepare for more response plan in light of those potential regulatory crackdown and even business restrictions in the coming years. So in the near term, we expect that the Chinese government will continue to increase infrastructure investment in the coming years. They have actually done the same in the past few decades to boost the economic growth. However, we expect that in the long term, the government will try to turn most of their investment into the manufacturing sector because it's Xi Jinping's top concerns to strengthen indigenous product of China in the next few decades. Industry related to national security, including technology and also military status, will most likely benefit most, because we expect that national security will emerge as the top concern of Xi Jinping after this party congress. According to the work report and also previous statement made by Xi Jinping and other senior leaders in China, so national security will become the most key driver of government policy making in the next few years, because China somehow aware that the decoupling between China and the US will continue in the next few years. And because of the intensifying geopolitical tensions, Xi Jinping would likely try to strengthen national security in China for the next few years. Of course, we have to bear in mind that the CCP usage of the phrase national security actually covers a lot of policy domain. For example, it includes military defense, economic resilience, but they also talk about stable energy supplies and food supplies. So it's actually a really broad concept. And therefore, we expect that national security will become the main driver of many policy domains in China for the next few years. So we expect that the Chinese leaders will almost certainly try to promote more tech self-resilience by boosting domestic local firms in the next year, because that Xi Jinping actually viewed technology development as the key pillar of national security. So as we can observe from the below graph, China has been encouraging a lot of private and public investment into the tech industry over the past 5 years. This includes tax reduction and also more high-level education. So we also saw that Xi Jinping has added a new section in his work report called Science and Education. So it means that Xi Jinping will likely accelerate the development of local innovation and advanced technology industry in the coming years. So, for example, we have seen that the US is trying to introduce more export controls and other business restrictions, trying to limit China's ability to produce advanced technology equipment. The Chinese government is also well aware of this, and therefore they will continue to do more to support Chinese indigenous tech industry and try to attract more international talents into China. However, more support will also mean that there will be more regulations over the tech industry. The Chinese government is really keen to avoid repeating the failure of funding local semiconductor producers in the past few years, because many of the Chinese chip makers have been failed to provide some really advanced technical breakthroughs in terms of chip production. And therefore, the government will likely increase supervision and also scrutiny over local tech firms in the coming years. It will also impact international tech firms, because we expect that there will be more and more regulatory crackdown and also regulations on some more sensitive business activities, including cross-border data transfer and also the development of key tech infrastructures in the coming years. So we expect that China will continue to tighten rules on the tech sectors based on national security concerns. So another policy domain which will be impacted by the focus on national security will be the public health policy. So actually, despite of its economic growth, impacts on the economic growth, Xi Jinping actually views zero COVID policy as one of his most greatest achievements over the past few years. And therefore, under Xi Jinping's people first principle, the virus will remain a serious threat to Chinese people. And therefore, it seems that China will continue to maintain zero COVID policy for some more months. So we expect that domestic measures, including mask mandates and also regular PCR testing, will remain in place in the coming years. Of course, Xi Jinping is also well aware of the economic damage. So he will try to somehow restore investors' confidence into the Chinese market by allowing some of the limited relaxation in terms of border policy. For example, the visa policy and also trying to ease the quarantine requirement. And also the likelihood of a citywide lockdown in major business hubs, like what we have seen in Shanghai earlier this year, will unlikely happen again. However, we don't expect that a large-scale removal of public health restrictions will happen until Q2 next year, because there will be another important political event taking place in Beijing next March, which is the Two Sessions meeting. And therefore, we expect that the overall pace of the COVID exit plan in China will be gradual and slow, and a full reopening of border will unlikely happen in the first few months of the next year. So I will now hand over to Judith for more on China's foreign policy.
Great. Thank you, Cyrus. I'm going to begin by outlining how we see China's foreign policy following the Party Congress. Overall, we assess that there is significant policy continuity with no major shifts on issues like its relationship with the United States or on the Taiwan question itself. Xi's work report shares the same assertive tone that his 2017 report to the 19th Party Congress did. He believes China's influence and authority on the world stage continue to rise, and the government has been successful in defending Chinese interests abroad. This stance needs to be maintained as Xi paints a vision of a more threatening and sinister world. He says China faces drastic changes in the international landscape, especially external attempts to blackmail, contain, blockade, and exert maximum pressure on the country. The speech makes clear that there's no reason to change course, at least in terms of the current foreign policy approach. A more hostile world means that Beijing should double down on asserting itself in order to protect its national interests, as it was the only way through protecting and promoting national security that China achieves its ultimate aim of national rejuvenation. The government believes that by ensuring national security, the country can better withstand unforeseen events or direct threats to its well-being, harking back to what Cyrus was saying about national security being this overarching umbrella here. However, I think it's important to mention that the speech itself was very light on specifics on how the CCP would actually achieve this. Xi listed 5 challenges for the country over the next 5 years. Firstly, there will be external attempts to suppress and contain China, which may escalate unexpectedly. The second big challenge is the global economic slowdown itself. The third, regional conflicts, which was a veiled reference, I suppose, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Fourth, black swan events, incidents that are unforeseen, as well as finally, gray rhinos. These are events that are underappreciated, but are known to the Chinese state and are likely to have significant impact on its well-being going forward. Gray rhinos, I think, are especially significant to highlight because Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said that gray rhinos include Taiwanese independence. So it's something that we will be watching that phrase over time. But all in, these 5 challenges indicate that there is a much more pessimistic outlook about China's place in the world and about China's responses to these challenges. So it's likely to see at best some stasis in China's foreign policy approach, particularly its relations with major powers, or at worst some deterioration there. So while relations with the West are strained, China is looking forward to expanding its influence away from the West. Xi has vowed to establish a new type of international relations with other emerging market economies. This is a departure from the previous work report that called for strengthening coordination between China and the West. Xi will instead prioritize building economic and diplomatic ties with like-minded developing nations. As such, we expect Beijing to commit to leading non-Western transnational organizations, including the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations and the BRICS and so on. We see these moves as a form of decoupling from the West and a challenge to a US-led architecture of international bodies and forums. Xi conducted his first overseas trip since the start of the pandemic to Kazakhstan in mid-September, and then he traveled to Uzbekistan to attend the SCO. The prioritization of these former Soviet states indicates that China sees the region as crucial to its Belt and Road Initiative, which it launched in 2014. Also, like-minded governments in these areas are unlikely to criticize and will often agree with China's repressive tactics domestically, so that they make, in that respect, ideal partners for a China that is pivoting away from a liberal democratic order. However, I think, again, it's important to remember the form of diplomacy that will be used by China in the years ahead will remain broadly similar to that of its recent past. It will maintain its preference for using trade, loans, and investment as soft power as a means to develop its global influence. Ultimately, there remains little appetite for China internally and externally to become a leading provider of security guarantees to its allies. Away from its Eurasian backyard, many nations would also welcome an influx of Chinese investment should it actually manifest. It's worth pointing out that, as Cyrus has outlined, this isn't actually a particularly great time for the Chinese economy, to put it mildly. So it's unclear whether or not those investments will actually manifest. As the chart indicates here, there has been an increase in investment in some developing markets over time. However, as you can see, it is largely concentrated in Asia, broadly speaking. And so this encompasses a lot of MENA countries as well, because the World Bank's figures, where I've taken this from, has a very broad definition of what encompasses Asia. But by and large, Chinese investment remains concentrated in the region, at least in terms of raw expenditure figures. China lags behind the EU and North America in terms of investment still in Africa, and it does not make the top 10 of investors in terms of FDI stock, at least, in investing in Latin America. So I think that when you hear reports of Chinese investment abroad, yes, it has increased, but it's something that we should sort of put into a wider global context here. The question is really whether or not greater investment in an area actually leads to greater influence. And I think there's a tendency to see countries as either pro or anti-China, or simply parasitic entities that are happy or unhappy if investment is a bit too shallow. So that's, I think, not a great reading of the situation. But I think it's important to remember that countries, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, have a much more nuanced relationship with China. They see the relationship as beneficial, but are simultaneously wary of Chinese ambitions. Many, like the Philippines, have done remarkable waters. Likewise, Indonesia adopts the same approach. But I think that this balancing act is going to be increasingly hard because of the US's recent economic measures that are increasingly forcing countries to pick sides in their decoupling. So, as I mentioned earlier, US-China relations are strained, and here they are at a low point. The US's recent national defense strategy, released a few weeks ago, clearly articulates that China is the primary threat to the US's political, defense, and security establishment. And those establishments need to focus on the Chinese threat specifically in the coming years. I believe it's worth restating the US's concerns. China presents a real physical threat to US allies beyond Taiwan. China has made spurious claims to territorial waters of key allies, including Japan and the Philippines, as well as many other Southeast Asian countries. It also seeks to rewrite international norms, particularly in the realm of physical security and law and the rules of trade. And increasingly, it is meddling to undermine democratic institutions, primarily through election disinformation campaigns in Canada, Australia, and most recently, the United States. Compounding this change in perception from the United States, or I think in many instances, an explicit acknowledgement for the first time of China as its key rival, is the fact that the Biden administration took its most aggressive actions against China in the last month. As Cyrus mentioned, it announced a raft of measures that limit the sale of semiconductors and the equipment to make them to Chinese customers. This is a bid to curb Chinese companies from using them to develop comparable technology in order to maintain its own advantage domestically in science and technology. The US added 31 Chinese chip makers to a list of unverified companies, which would lead them to being blacklisted. And this would prevent the US from supplying them with technology. These export controls prohibit US citizens as well, and firms from working with Chinese companies in advanced chip making. I think it is also notable that no major US ally joined them in this effort. So the US is going at this alone, but still has the potential to have huge shifts in the market, as we saw from crashes in stock market prices of stocks for these companies in the immediate aftermath of this policy. That said, this decoupling is going to take some time. If you look at the chart that I've got on the screen, just the sheer scale and volume of imports and exports is going to make this process a very difficult one over the longer term. The CCP, though, has not explicitly retaliated to the latest chip activity. It's likely because when it was announced, it was busy prepping for the party congress. But I reckon that it's going to respond in the next few weeks with retaliatory measures, even though Beijing has been typically very reluctant to take strong actions targeting US companies in China. It's got tools such as the Unreliable Entities List and the Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law. But with these new restrictions from the United States targeting key parts of the Chinese technology sector, particularly in AI and supercomputing, and a broad range of companies in those sectors, Beijing may be forced to react with stronger asymmetric measures targeting things like the rare earth mineral sector and the electric vehicle sector to prevent international firms from seeking an advantage there. So given all of this, and as we've been emphasizing that we've got a darker view of the world, we've got strained relations with the West, I suppose it's time that we talk about Taiwan, big kahuna here. And we do not think, specifically in the year ahead, that a threat of a Chinese takeover of Taiwan has increased substantially. Beijing is not planning an imminent invasion or a major revision to its current tactics. There will be broad continuity in its Taiwan policy over the next 12 months. However, there are two small changes that stand out from Xi Jinping's speech. Firstly, his work report included a statement that was absent in the 19th Party Congress report that China explicitly opposes foreign interference in matters relating to Taiwan. This is an indication of the Chinese growing concerns about the US support of Taiwan, as well as the support Taiwan has been receiving from international actors like the EU. Second, the report also mentions that China has strengthened its strategic initiative for China's complete reunification. The phrase strategic initiative is not new, but has typically been associated with preventing and diffusing risks, and it's the first time it's been used in the context of Taiwan. We believe it represents China's desire to exert greater control over the cross-straits dynamics and to make progress on unification. So how do you make progress on unification? To achieve this, the CCP will firstly have to double down on its military modernization processes. Xi said in the speech that he wants to elevate the PLA to world-class standards, and they've been trying to speed up defense modernization. But again, this language is not new and reflects the difficulty with speeding up any timeline because defense procurement processes are long and protracted. Training large numbers of staff, and particularly an army as large as the PLA, will take time. And as you can see, like defense expenditure, both if you believe the official figures or figures compiled by independent third parties, China's expenditure has been rising, but it's been rising at a fairly steady rate as well. So I don't think we're going to see huge accelerations in its capabilities imminently. However, we are likely to see a rise in the number of incursions into Taiwan's airspace in the year ahead. And this, I think, is particularly dangerous because it raises the prospect of unintended collisions with the Taiwanese or other aircrafts in the area. It demonstrates increasingly these tactics to the Taiwanese people, and I think specifically the business community in Taiwan, that the government has limited sovereignty over its skies and also its waters, because let's not forget, naval incursions are also occurring simultaneously. The rhetoric from China will remain increasingly bellicose, but the cost of war, I think it's important to emphasize this, still remain very high. Invading Taiwan is no easy process. So I think that, again, we're not looking at any form of imminent invasion. We're going to see a continuation of the gray zone tactics that we've seen characterizing this space over the next few months. So we've gone through a lot of information with you today. I think it's in summary, I think that the top line, if you're going to take anything away, is that Xi Jinping has successfully consolidated power through this party congress and over the last decade. Cyrus mentioned this at the start, but it means the political agenda is going to take precedence over economic growth, and that growth is going to remain sluggish, at least for the next year. China will work hard to achieve greater technological independence from the West and also claim leadership in non-Western forums, thus accelerating its decoupling from the West. And finally, given his emphasis on national security, Xi will seek to assert control over Taiwan in the coming years, but an imminent invasion is not likely. Again, I appreciate that was a lot of information, so I'm very happy at this juncture to open the floor up to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Judith and Cyrus. You will be delighted to know that we have got some questions for you. So maybe I can direct the first one to Cyrus. The first question is, are you finding that many or any clients are leaving China because they assess that the business risks of operating there are no longer worthwhile?
Yep, actually, we can refer this question based on the some of the reports made by those industry associations and also different organizations in China. So, for example, one of the reports from the EUCCC actually point out that a lot of European firms based in Hong Kong are actually planning to leave by the end of next year because of the COVID policy in Hong Kong and China, and also because of the integration of a legal system within Hong Kong and China. So some of the firms actually also pointed out that there have been growing risks regarding the US and China competition, because many firms have been facing more compliance challenge, and therefore to avoid making choice between US and China, they will try to relocate their business operations to somewhere else. So it seems that the trend will likely continue in the coming years, especially when the Chinese government is trying to focus more on supporting Chinese local firms instead of attracting international firms. So the trend will likely continue. So we'll have to see if Xi Jinping will try to adjust its policy agenda and try to lower down the tension between China and the West in an effort to attract more Western companies back to the mainland China.
Great, thank you very much. And I think maybe I will direct the next one to you as well. The next question we have is, as you mentioned, Li Chang's been promoted recently. He appears to have been quite unsuccessful in his current role in Shanghai, or previous role in Shanghai, but he's still received this promotion because of his loyalty. How damaging do you think that this focus on promoting loyalists over competent technocrats will be in terms of governance and internal stability over the coming years?
First of all, I think the major problems of promoting loyalists instead of experienced bureaucrat to the leadership level will be the Chinese government will be more difficult to correct or even revise Xi Jinping's policy. So let's say if there is any mistake during Xi Jinping's policy making, the leadership surrounding himself will unlikely try to significantly adjust the policy direction. So take Xi Jinping's civil code policy as an example. So it seems that some of the economic liberals within the party, like Premier Li Qiqiang or Vice Premier Wang Yan, had been trying to somehow slow down the implementation of the civil code policy in some major business hubs. So as these economic liberals are going to leave the party leadership this year, so perhaps there will be less possibility that the Chinese leadership will try to correct some of Xi Jinping's wrong policies in the future. So the second problem will be, I think there will be more government interference at the local level. So in the previous years, usually some of the Chinese local government officials will try to get promotion by simply increasing economic growth. But now, as Xi Jinping is trying to focus more on social goals and loyalty, which are much more difficult to be measured or verified by data and statistics. So I think the local government official may try to introduce different and more business restrictions, trying to prove that they are loyal and have a great determination to implement Xi Jinping's agenda to get promotion. So it means that there will be a lot of different business restrictions across different provinces or cities in China. So it will somehow cause business disruption or challenge to international firms operating in China in the coming years.
Thank you very much. So it's a relatively bleak picture from both of those answers. Moving on to something that's probably not significantly less bleak, one for you, Judith. What lessons will she have learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine in relation to its military strategy regarding Taiwan?
That's a big one. I think it's the question that's been on everyone's mind since the invasion began. I suspect that the obvious one is simply that Russia has miscalculated and overreached. So simply by going in all the way to Kiev was clearly disastrous, and they had to roll back. And it's sort of embarrassment that I think that if the Chinese were ever planning a full-scale invasion, that they would seek to avoid. So I think it reinforces any analysis that suggests that China will prefer, if at all costs, to try and avoid a full-scale invasion of this sort and pressure the Taiwanese government through its various gray zone tactics. And to be explicit about what those are, it's simply that they are constraining the Taiwanese government's ability to control its defense spaces, so its skies and its seas, and to thus pressure the Taiwanese allies, so namely the United States, in seeing that resistance is futile, and that the overwhelming force and buildup of the Chinese military along the eastern and southeastern coasts is too overwhelming to overcome, to come to Taiwan's aid. So increasingly that, plus cyber attacks, and also attempts at outreach to the Taiwanese people through propaganda and whatnot, that's all going on in the background.
And sticking on the foreign policy theme, so another one for you, Judith. You noted earlier China's increasing involvement in mis or disinformation campaigns, including efforts to target US and other Western elections. How capable is China in this field? And to what extent does the No Limits partnership with Russia portend combined operations between Russia and China in this area?
So that is a big question. I think I'll tackle the first bit first, just to sort of set the stage for the capabilities aspect. I think that at the moment, capabilities, particularly those targeting Western societies, are, the technical term would be ham-fisted and very poorly done. You can see that Meta, for example, released a report about the Chinese disinformation operation recently, and it showed, and I think in previous research that I've done myself, just how out of touch the CCP's operatives manning these attacks are in terms of their use of language. Like the fact that they are not native English speakers shows that they don't know the pressure points particularly well within, or the fault lines within these societies, that they exploit them, but in a very, very obvious way. So for example, in the lead up to the US midterms, which took place yesterday, the Chinese, I guess, state trolls really, were saying things very, very explicitly, like, down to the United States. The United States commits atrocities abroad, blah, 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 blah. So it's very ham-fisted at that level. That said, I think where they are more successful is when they choose to muddy the water simply by the amount of information that they put out online. And, the sort of wolf warriors on social media, where people are being overwhelmed with criticism, any prominent speaker who criticizes China is overwhelmed by trolls, that drives them off platforms, or that clouds the ability of the original speech or the original critique to be heard properly. So whenever UN envoys, for example, make statements about China's treatment of its Uyghur population, there will be a flood of official and unofficial criticisms, either condemning the speaker as being a paid agent, or alternatively saying that, the Uyghurs are treated very well, for example. And so that just clouds the waters.
Right, so a bit of a mixed bag then. We've got one more question for now, which I will pass on to Cyrus. But again, if anyone listening has other questions, please do send them in. To China, Cyrus, one for you. What is common prosperity? What is this this phrase that's been bandied about? And how will advancing the common prosperity agenda affect China as a place to do business in the next few years?
Okay, so I think common prosperity is a rather new concept to many of the people living outside China. So, but actually, it is not entirely new. So the phrase common prosperity has been used by previous Chinese leaders many decades ago, like Chairman Mao Zedong. So the concept common prosperity is actually a phrase similar to wealth redistribution. So it means that China is going to regulate some of the excessive accumulation of wealth of the rich people, and also trying to encourage some of the big firms or rich people to donate to redistribute their wealth to the poor people. So it's not entirely new, but it's only recently being picked up by Xi Jinping again last year. So it seems that it's one of the core goal of Xi Jinping's social policy agenda in the next few years. Because as we have mentioned, Xi Jinping is quite keen to achieve its social goals, trying to gain legitimacy to govern the Chinese people for the next few years. And therefore, after Xi Jinping first reintroduced the concept common prosperity last year, we have seen many Chinese firms trying to set up charity funds or try to donate much of their profits to the poor people. So, of course, we have not seen any official policy statement trying to force those firms or rich people to donate, or trying to have a reform of tax system in the future, trying to redistribute their wealth. But we expect that there will be more similar business restrictions in the coming years. For example, there will likely be more antitrust campaign trying to regulate the illegal wealth accumulation and trying to force those rich people and big firms to do less of those antitrust business operations in the future. So we expect that there will be more business restrictions across different local government in the coming years. And it means that there will be, again, more regulatory challenge for international firms to face in the future.
Thank you very, very much. I can't see any more questions that have come in. So I think what's left for me to do is thank you, Judith and Cyrus, again for your insights. It's been really helpful. Thank you everyone who's joined for sending in those questions, which are also extremely interesting. I hope that you found the webinar useful. As I said earlier, we're very happy to take further questions about this or any other issues by email. info@torchlight.ai, as you can see up there, is the address to use. And it would be remiss of me not to mention that we've just launched our new portal. If you're an existing or perhaps a prospective client, please do feel free to get in touch at that same email address, and we would be very happy to give you a walkthrough of it. Thank you very much again.